Welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our study of the effects of the French Revolution and Napoleon by looking at the unification of a place called Germany. And so we're going to continue to take these ideas of conservative, liberal, radical, and nationalism, but now we're going to move to the German-speaking regions and look at how this process developed quite differently from the process that we looked at in Italy yesterday. So today we're going to explain the basic difficulties in uniting Germany and explain why there wasn't a Germany yet. We're going to evaluate the strategy used by a guy named Otto von Bismarck, who's going to be the sort of central character in our story here, to overcome those challenges. And then specifically, we're going to look at the Franco-Prussian War and look at the long-term effects of this conflict, because it's going to be really influential in history going forward. So let's dive in. The problem with Germany and with uniting a Germany is that there are German-speaking people sort of all over the place. They're not near as geographically concentrated as the Italians were or the English were. And so the problem with creating a Germany is who's in and who's out. Because as you see here, and as we hopefully remember previously, in Central Europe there's all these sort of small independent princedoms that are divided by culture and by religion. As we hopefully remember, the Protestant Reformation happened in Germany, and so there's a lot of bad blood related to that. And the even larger problem is that there's all these German-speaking people within like the Austrian Empire and within the French Empire. And so if you're creating a Germany, are you going to tear those German people away from those countries? I mean, who's in, who's out? And how are you going to convince Austria and France to give up some of their German-speaking regions? So that's the basic German problem and why there hasn't been a Germany yet. The most powerful of the small German princedoms, as you hopefully remember from back in Unit 4, is Prussia. Prussia is a relatively powerful, again, as we said, German-speaking region led by the House of Hohenzollern. We hopefully remember Frederick the Great, who turned Prussia into a military powerhouse with his use of incredibly effective, well-trained, and well-drilled infantry. And we remember that Prussia was a leading force back in when we talked about the volcano of 1848, was a leading force in German unification. And a lot of the radicals and the liberals at the Frankfurt Parliament wanted the King of Prussia to become King of Germany. But as we hopefully remember from, again, a couple days ago, they demanded that he accept a constitution in order to do so, which he refused to do. And so the King of Prussia refused the crown to become King of Germany because, again, he felt like it would limit his power. So in order for this unification to happen, it needs to come from a conservative point of view for a couple different reasons. Mostly because the conservatives and the German nobles, the Junkers, were very powerful within this region, and so they're not going to stand for any type of liberalism. And because obviously the King of Prussia needs to be a leading force here, and he's not going to accept any type of liberalism. So enter Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. His goal was to unify Germany under the leadership of the Prussians, but with a conservative bent. And so he started to use a lot of the language of nationalism to help focus the German peasants and mobilize them and get them to see the Kaiser as like a symbol of their Germanness, and really embrace the king in that way. And so by controlling the conservative German peasants, Bismarck felt like he could start the process of German unification. And then, of course, his other piece is blood and iron. Using Prussia's strength and their military and economic might to then build up Prussia and then fight several wars against their neighbors in order to complete the process of unification. We often describe this strategy as realpolitik, which is basically doing whatever you need to do in order to achieve your goals, not necessarily focusing on morality and the correctness of your actions. So the goal, again, very slowly gobble up. As you can see here, here's Otto von Bismarck gobbling up some smaller German princedoms, gobbling up these territories by breaking them off from Austria and France. So we start with the 7 Weeks' War, which is a war that was provoked by Bismarck but declared by Austria. Basically, he insulted the Austrian ambassador, got the Emperor of Austria to declare war, crushed the Austrian army, because, of course, the Prussian army is the cream of the crop in Europe at this point. So crushed the Austrian army, and then, most importantly, decided not to take Vienna. So rather than conquering Vienna and fully bringing Austria into this new German empire, instead, they negotiated a very sort of favorable truce with Austria, keeping Austria out of the German empire and not creating bad blood. But the result is Otto von Bismarck did get the ability to start annexing some of these southern German areas, especially Bavaria, which is an incredibly valuable and wealthy region that needed to be part of this German empire. So 7 Weeks' War gets him some of these princedoms and then keeps Austria out, which is almost as important. Here we see Otto von Bismarck's famous Blood and Iron speech, basically describing that it's not about constitutions, it's not about speeches, but it's about what you can do with your army and the military and economic might you can build. The final step in German unification is a conflict known as the Franco-Prussian War. This was provoked in basically the same way by Otto von Bismarck, in that he insulted the French ambassador, or he basically spread this tale that the king of Prussia insulted the French ambassador. And although this was not literally true, and it was mostly fabricated, he leaked the story to the press, and the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, took the bait and declared war. Napoleon hoped that he was somewhat worried about the growing power of Prussia, and he hoped that his newly revitalized French Empire could knock Prussia down a peg and sort of slow the process of German unification. And man, was he wrong. Unfortunately, Prussia was far more prepared than France was for this war. They had set up rail lines in order to move their troops around, so the Prussian military moved much quicker than France did. And they used these new rail lines to ship their much larger artillery. And so we're starting to see relatively large cannons being used, which is going to be a massive game changer in military conflicts moving forward. For the French, the whole thing was a disaster. Napoleon tried to lead his army by himself. He was sort of in the mold of his famous uncle. And the Prussian military utterly crushed him at the Battle of Sedan. The new Prussian artillery just utterly eviscerated the French assault. The French were still using these Napoleonic sort of human wave assaults with fixed bayonets, and the Prussian guns cut them to pieces. It went so poorly that Napoleon himself was surrounded and captured, which did not actually end the war, because, of course, the French people have a lot of pride and are going to fight on. But it does lead to Napoleon being deposed and the end of our Second French Empire. So here we see the humiliated Napoleon meeting with the German nobility. And this is going to forever start shifting the balance of power away from France and now towards Prussia and later Germany. As I mentioned, Napoleon was deposed, and so the French did not surrender. So Otto von Bismarck marched to Paris, which is in a sort of sharp contrast with how he treated the Austrians. He surrounded the city and then began to bombard it into submission with his, again, new massive artillery. You could see pictured here. The French really started to struggle. The people inside the city started to starve, eating basically anything you could eat. And prices skyrocketed. As you can see here, this is a shop selling rats to the wealthy of Paris, because if you had a lot of money, maybe you could afford a rat to eat, whereas the poor people more or less starved. They fought on for a while, but eventually this combination of starvation and bombardment led the people of Paris to surrender, and the war came to a close. Here we see Otto von Bismarck and his German army marching through the Arc de Triomphe, Napoleon's sort of monument to his victory, emphasizing the humiliation of the French people. With that, France is defeated and the German Empire is declared. As just sort of an extra poke in the eye to the French, the German Empire is actually declared in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, which was massively humiliating to the French people to have their symbol, one of their symbols of national pride and authority, be basically just a set piece or a backdrop for Otto von Bismarck declaring the German Empire. So that's super humiliating. And they had to pay a ludicrous amount of money. So Otto von Bismarck forced an incredibly harsh treaty on the people of France. And this, again, is going to create some significant bad blood in the future, leaving the French with a desire to humiliate and punish the Germans the same way they were humiliated and punished. But for Germany, this is awesome. They now get the region of Alsace-Lorraine here in between, which is an incredibly valuable and wealthy region. And Germany is now complete. And so we have a German empire under the leadership of the Prussian king, who becomes the first Kaiser of the German Empire. The Parisians don't take this lying down, and they refuse to accept the results of the treaty. Radicals in Paris seize control of the government and declare themselves the Paris Commune, a place in which they're going to use these new socialist ideas of equality in order to basically mobilize the people the same way they mobilized them during the French Revolution, fight back against the Germans and the corrupt politicians in Versailles, and bring the people back to power. Obviously, the French government in Versailles is not going to stand for this, and they mobilize an army to go march on the new Paris Commune. We'll read some of the documents from the Paris Commune with our primary sources today. And the end result is that the Paris Commune is crushed. A significant portion of the city is burned down in what's called the Bloody Week, in which the revolutionaries were again suppressed. And so the communards, the communists, are forced from power, and France becomes a republic, but a liberal republic, with the politicians in Paris and in Versailles controlling things, and the radicals in Paris now crushed. So this brings us back to our central questions. Hopefully you can answer these in some detail. And tomorrow we'll be explaining how the forces of nationalism influenced other countries, moving over to the Ottoman Empire, and then after that all the way over to Russia.